to be recording this. I just started the recording right now. So, and hopefully I'll be able to get this up, and I will send out a link when I finally succeed in getting these things into YouTube in some type of fashion that is pleasant to listen to and pleasant to see. So without further ado, let me see if I can bring up that slide deck. Share the screen. Okay, can everybody see the screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, then I'm going to start at this slide right here. Now, again, talking about New Jersey, I've kind of divided this up into two segments as well. Something that I've had direct personal experience with and that I've had a chance to research over the years and the things that I have discovered. The initial event was somewhat interesting, but I think that as you look at these things over the years, more things become apparent and therefore adds more gravity to what we're going to be discussing. This first slide, it was basically in 1958, I lived on a farm in Colts Neck. The farm was called Dorbrook Farm. And back in the early 30s, it was a training camp for John Tooney in his fight prior to fighting against, who was the boxer? And, well, it was a famous heavyweight fight anyway. Anyway, he did train on this farm. The farm itself consists of 333 acres. When I lived on it, it was owned by a gentleman that owned all the Miles shoe stores and also all the Tom McAn shoe stores. He was a gentleman farmer and a very pleasant person in his own right. The farm itself raised, they had about 60 head of Jersey cows that were all prize winning. And in the 1950s, those cows, each one was about $2,000 a head. And the bulls that he owned were about $50,000 a head. So equate that to 1950 prices, and you see that it was a very, very expensive farm. Now, this farm is co-located along with what we call the Navy Road here in Monmouth County. The Navy Road is actually called Normandy Road, and it links an ammunition storage facility that belongs to the U.S. Navy in Colts Neck to its pier facilities on Raritan Bay, which is about 13.2 miles to the north. And along this road, well, the road consists of a 2-lane highway and also a 2-track train line, all private. And the only time you were able to drive on that road was if you worked for the Navy or you were crossing at one of the several crossings between Colts Neck and the pier facility. The road also, you knew when they were moving interesting munitions. Now, the Navy, in its infinite wisdom, never acknowledged, and still doesn't to this day, that they stored nuclear weapons at the storage facility and moved them along this road to and from the pier. Now, because they did move munitions, when there were interesting munitions being moved, they had squads of armed Marines that would shut down the crossroads and stay there until the train or the trucks had passed. So we knew that, the locals all knew that they were moving interesting ammunition. So over the years, this road and the storage facility, as well as the pier facility, attracted UFO activity. It's been reported. It was investigated by some investigators, and it was always of interest to the UFO community. Now, when I lived on there in July of 1958, we had a daylight sphere. Now, the Navy Road was about 250, 300 yards from my house. So the sphere was directly over the Navy Road and was flying to the south, heading towards the storage facilities. It was a shiny silver sphere. It had red and white lights, that were flashing all around it. That okay, I think somebody has their, could you mute your phone, please? Okay, thank you. You can, so the sphere was flying in a very slow fashion on that date. And my father tried calling Fort Monmouth, which is about 2 or 3 miles away as well. And he couldn't get through the switchboard. We assumed that it was jammed because of all the people that were reporting it. Well, that didn't turn out to be the case because it was never formally reported in the papers that I had ever seen. So, excuse me, one more. Okay, and so now that was 1958. When I talk about a synchronicity to all of this, 1970 was an interesting year. Well, 1958, before I had my sighting in May of 1958, a Nike Ajax site that was about 7 or 8 miles closer to the pier facility, also right on that Navy road, blew up in what was the worst accident in the history of Nike missile system. Nike, of course, being a surface-to-air missile that was run by the Army. The battery blew up and it killed 10 men, 6 soldiers and 4 DoD civilians. That was in May. That was May 22nd, 1958. July, the end of July, I can't remember the exact date, is when we saw the UFO on the Navy Road near Doorbrook Farm. Now, in 1970, there was another reported event, and that took place a couple miles away from where the Nike facility blew up and a couple miles away from where the pier facility was. So I'm going to move on here just to give you the background of why I think this is all important to what's happening in New Jersey. In 1957, in the international group, International Council of Scientific Unions, decided that they were going to designate July 1st, 1957 through December 31st, 1958 as the International Geophysical Year. And that consisted basically of 12,000 scientists from a number of countries all over the world that were doing scientific studies of the atmosphere, just about every aspect of the Earth they were looking at. Magnetosphere, the atmosphere, and at the same time, of course, in 1957, October 4th, Sputnik was launched. So now we have all of this activity going on, and also the birth of the space age, at least for sending things into space that we know of. And that was the Russians with Sputnik. So here are all these things that are kind of coming to a head in this period of time. And every one of them are somewhat joined at the hip with what should be or could be of interest to the UFO phenomenon. We already have the nuclear weapons. 1945, we set off the first atomic bombs. Now we had a means of delivering them into space. So now it was like a double whammy. So the IGY got kicked off. Everybody was participating in it in varying ways. But the interesting thing is that we also had a lot of nuclear testing going on, primarily by the United States, Soviet Union, and Great Britain, and later on France. So we had over 100 tests in the air and above the atmosphere and in the water during that time period, setting off in several major areas around the world. And again, are these designed to pull the UFO phenomenon into the light of day where it could be studied in of itself? So here we go. Great Britain, Operation Grapple. They had nuclear tests between 57 and 58, 9 tests, largest around 3 megatons. Now these are thermonuclear or hydrogen bombs that are being tested. Very much more powerful, obviously, than the atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Go on. United States is the granddaddy of testing. at the time. We had Plum Bob, which was the Nevada test site. There were 30 tests there in 57. Pacific Range, 39 tests, 1957. South Atlantic is an interesting. We actually had 3 high altitude tests. I believe that they were probably testing warheads that would go on to our Nike Hercules missiles, which we're going to talk about in a little while. And then, of course, we had the Nevada test range, Hardtack 2, with 30 tests in 1958. Hi, Nick. How you doing? Okay. So we're moving on. Now, I threw this slide in, even though this is not directly anything about New Jersey or New York area, but this is kind of an anecdotal mention of the largest thermonuclear device ever tested, ever built or ever tested. And it was built by the Soviet Union and tested in 1960. It was 57 megaton. That's 57 million tons of TNT, the equivalent. The fireball alone was 8 miles in diameter, and it had the temperature of the surface of the sun. The blast area beyond that was another 35 or 40 miles, in that it was a massive, the fireball for the mushroom cloud was 35 kilometers high. And the picture that you see there in the upper right-hand corner, that is taken from over 100 kilometers away. That was a massive explosion. Did it have any military value? No, not really. But it did have a lot of terror value that got people's attention. But interestingly, the Russian scientist that was the grandfather of that explosion was so moved by the power of it that he became one of the major advocates for peace until the day he died. An enormous amount of power. But interestingly, also something that you don't have to be a rocket scientist or have great technology to observe something like that from space going off. So again, is this something that is drawing out the UFO, UAP phenomenon? I believe it is. Okay, going on. Now I mentioned here are the Navy Road incidents, and this is just some of them. This isn't even all of them. Starting in the upper left-hand corner, we have a newspaper article from July of 1970. And this actually took place. You can't really see it very well there, but there is a crop circle in the ground that's about 1.5 miles away from the Navy Pier in Leonardo. Port Monmouth is part of Middletown Township. The witnesses actually watched this thing land in the swampy area behind their house. The police chief at the time was actually hired by my wife's grandfather when he was a deputy police chief in Middletown Township back in the 50s. This police chief that was there in 1970 was a no-nonsense police chief. He didn't take any guff from anybody, and he didn't usually buy the stories, but he came out and very, very strongly supported the witnesses on this because his people had called on numerous occasions for UFO activity. So that was one thing. Just to the right of that Courier article, that's a picture of the damage that was done from the worst Nike accident in the history of Nike Ajax, where 10 men were killed, 6 soldiers and 4 civilians. This was adjacent to the Navy Road. Right now, the facility or the site where this blew up is now the recycling yard for Middletown Township. It's at the foot of Cane Lane. To the right of that is you can't see it, but I'll explain what you're looking at. That is the aerial view of Doorbrook Park or Doorbrook Farm when I lived on it. And it shows where the crop circle showed up in 2002, which is the blue arrow in the upper left-hand corner. And then the green arrow points to a red arrow down in the lower right-hand corner. And that's the UFO direction of flight and the view from where we sat in front of my house looking across 537. The other picture, again, that's a Nike Ajax battery. I throw this one in just to show the correlation between Nike missiles and UFOs especially back in the 1950s. This is the only Durwood Nike battery, which was called Whiskey 93. And 93 and 94 were both sites that had UFO sightings over a 2-week period over their facilities. And then at the end of that second week, one of these vehicles crashed outside the launcher area, dropping off debris, and it was able to somehow take off again. But it dropped off radioactive debris that the Air Force came and removed and debriefed the Nike crew, the soldiers that were stationed at the IFC. There's a video that I also have of the gentleman that was a radar operator at that site, going into great detail about how it transpired, what happened, how it was moved away, and so on. And that happened May of 1958, the same month that the Nike site, Whiskey 50, New York 53, where the 10 men were killed. It happened within days of one another. So is there a correlation between those two events? I'm saying there may be. I'm not saying there definitely is, but I think there very well may be. Then we go down as far as other things that are drawing the phenomenon into this area, specifically Monmouth County. In the lower left-hand corner of this slide is a map of Fort Monmouth. Now, Fort Monmouth is the U.S. Army Communications and Electronics Command. It was bracked a couple of years ago and moved down to Maryland. However, back in the day, this was also the home of the Army Signal Corps. And the Army Signal Corps are the ones that developed radar, at least for the Army and Army Air Force, back during World War II. And that's the site that, if you look at my screenshot behind my head, that antenna was part of that radar lab. That radar lab was also key to a sighting that took place over a 2-week period back in 1950-51. Ed Asner was actually a radar operator at Fort Monmouth at the time, and he validated that they did have sightings and they had radar tracking of objects that became part of Project Grudge and Project Sign. So you have radar, you have Fort Monmouth with everything that it entails as far as computers and electronics and radio and communications and radar, of course, laser technology. It was all state-of-the-art military equipment, also something that would draw the interest of the UFO community. Now, not lastly, but next to the Fort Monmouth map, you have the aerial shot of Eve Bell Labs, where the transistor was invented by Shockley and his team in 1947. Also, that's where the Telstar, the first satellite communications, took place. Laser technology originated here, as did fiber optics and communications, optical communications, and much more. The Big Bang Theory. The antenna that did the Big Bang Theory is still part of the Bell Labs complex. Now it's called Bell Works, and it's privately owned, but they preserve the historical aspect. Incidentally, the picture that you're looking at is an exact replica. The site is designed to look like a transistor. So that's what you're looking at there. You're looking at a transistor. So down in the lower right-hand corner, there's a story from the Asbury Park Press and the photograph of the crop circle that showed up on Doorbrook Farm in 2002, about 200 yards behind where my house was. So in front of my house, we had the UFO activity in 58. Behind my house, we had the crop circle show up. You can't make this stuff up. I mean, this is all. Okay, so I'm going to take a break here because I've been rambling on at you. And so I'm going to give everybody a chance. If you'd like to comment or ask questions, I'll be more than happy to accommodate them. Hey, yes, Nick?
Okay, I just unmuted. Can you hear me okay?
A little quiet, but I hear you.
All right, I'll try to talk loudly. First of all, Joe, just congratulations again. This presentation is just cutting edge great. just thank you so much for all that you do to help solve these huge questions, important questions. Just thank you so much. I'm sure everybody here would agree with me that you deserve a
Nick,
hand.
Nick, Nick, can you
Thank you, Nick.
louder, please, Nick.
Yeah, louder. Okay, I have a brand new computer and it's on 100%. So I don't know why it's not better. but
Okay,
I'll
okay,
do
it's
what I
getting,
can. I'll talk loud. My first question is the transistor. That's always been a mystery to me. Did we back engineer that from a UFO crash or not? Does anybody have any reading on that?
okay. I'm going to jump in first and then others can join if they'd like. Over the years, I've been asking that same question, especially with Colonel Corso. In his book, he says how he's turned over crashed UFO components to private industry for reverse engineering. And that's a well-known statement that he made. He mentioned Bell Labs specifically. Now, I did talk to a very, very high-powered electrical engineer about the possibility of that happening, specifically from the Roswell crash. Now, Roswell crash was July of 1947. The transistor, I believe, was December of 1947. It was all within months. So according to this gentleman, it would take a number of years to be able to take something and reverse engineer it and come up with all the different components and the chemistry and whatnot. So he didn't think that the Roswell crash had anything to do with it. Now, with that being said, there were a number of other crashes over the years, also including one or two vehicles that were brought down during the Battle of Los Angeles, supposedly. So any one of these, or the Cape Girardeau in Missouri, that was several years before as well. So if it came from one of those crashes, I'm going to say that it's a definite possibility of being able to reverse engineer key components of that. Okay, but not so much the Roswell one, I don't think. Anybody else
Good
have
overview.
I'm sorry?
That was a good overview. Yeah,
Oh,
the
yeah.
Cape Girardeau and other crashes and things like this, because that information was being, or material was being reverse engineered for at least a decade before Roswell, right?
I believe so. I believe you're right, Bruce. Okay. Anybody else?
Also, fiber optics would be in that group. Also, fiber optics would that also be part of this idea that it might have been back engineered early on, and Bell got a hold of it and developed it further?
Not so much. My understanding is the first glass wire, if you will, was actually developed in the late 20s, early 30s. So they had the glass as an optical medium was already, I believe, there. Now, the electronics that went into that and the coherent light, I'm not exactly sure how exactly that or where that exactly came from. That could have come from definitely from a reverse engineering component.
Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else?
Yeah, I
Okay.
have a low tech. This I can't prove this, but I remember reading somewhere that Velcro had its origins in Roswell.
Yes. That's what I read as well. Now, whether that was at Bell Labs and Homedale, that I'm not exactly sure of. I believe it was mentioned, but again, the validity of it, I think that has to be researched a little bit.
Yeah, no, it's not the official story. The official story is that it was the brainchild of a Swiss engineer who noticed burrs on his dog's fur and developed it from that. But I also remember reading that they, it was part of Roswell, the discoveries at Roswell.
Yes, I read that as well. But again, we have to take a lot of this with a grain of salt, pending validation. And that's the problem with the whole UFO phenomenon, is being able to validate all the stories eyewitness stories are relatively straightforward, but what do they really prove besides there's a vehicle out there or something that looks like a vehicle, but we don't know where it's coming from. We don't know whether it's something, for instance, and this is kind of interesting, about maybe a year ago, Frank Chile shared a chart that was, I think it came from Douglas Aircraft or one of the big defense contractors. And this chart, in the military, they call them horse blankets. And it's a gigantic thing that you put up on a wall, and it shows step by step everything that needs to be done. It's like a project plan, or it also documents everything that has been done or is planned to be done. And this thing took technology being developed and what it would take to get us into space and traveling to the stars. And this came out, I think, the late 40s, maybe early 50s. And it had everything broken down very nicely. All bunch of engineers put this stuff together, you know, very bright people that were brainstorming and visualizing the future. And the thing had hundreds and hundreds of components on it. Well, the interesting thing, it was either I think it was Bob Wood, said everything on that chart that was supposed to take it out 150 to 200 years, he said by 1956, it would all be done. It was all accomplished. Now, if that's true, that means what we're looking at, the technologies that we enjoy on a daily basis, are archaic at best, and that everything that is needed to get us to the moon and beyond is already, you know, being used someplace by someone. So I think that kind of frames it. We're kind of like the mushrooms, you know, they were kept in the dark and fed a lot of manure, pardon the expression. You know, we don't know what's really going on, and we may never know till it's all passed us by. Anyway, okay, very, very good. That thing about Velcro, I agree. It was so simple. It had to be something we could develop. All you had to do is pay attention to a dog. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next slide here, unless anybody else have a question or comment or. Okay. All right. Now I mentioned, and again, what you're looking at here, the pier that you're looking at is the Navy pier that is attached at the hip to Colts Neck and the storage facilities. This is the longest finger pier in the world. It's 2.5 miles long. And all those ships you see there are ammunition ships that are tied up to it. To the right is a picture again of the damage from the Nike Ajax explosion. Nike Ajax is a surface-to-air missile, first generation, flies at Mach 2, around 1,600 miles per hour, and had a range of about 32 miles and a service ceiling of about 68,000 feet. A chain reaction blew up. That's the official story, is they were doing a safety upgrade to it. So obviously they didn't get to it in time because it obviously was not very safe. Down in the lower left-hand corner is actually the picture, and this you'll see at any installation that stores weapons. Now, this is primarily probably nuclear weapons, could be in those bunkers. They had bunkers similar to that at Rendlesham Forest at the Bentwaters Air Force Base. And that's where they stored the weapons. And again, this would be something
yes.
of the interest. So, and then of course to the right is the Courier article. Of course, you can't read it, but if you look down in the lower left-hand corner picture on the Courier, that was actually my science teacher from high school, who at the time was a major investigator for Monmouth County area, looking at everything from ghosts to UFOs. So, and again, this is a larger picture of the crop circle. It's up there, and then the red arrow is the UFO flight path following the Navy Road. The Navy Road is right there. And the green arrow is looking, that's how we viewed it, where we saw it. Now, I mentioned 1970. That's when the UFO landed, reportedly landed, left trace evidence Again, a number of scientists were researching it. And the article from the local Middletown newspaper, a weekly newspaper. Interestingly, now I give the missile battery that you're looking at up there is what we call New York 56. It's actually located at Sandy Hook on Gateway National Park. This is one of 2 remaining Nike sites in the world, and we have it as our museum. We've been restoring it. We have the lights in the radar vans and the battery control van. This is approximately 7 driving miles from where that UFO landed. And it's right there protecting the entrance to New York Harbor. We had 24 nuclear armed Nike Hercules missiles in 1970. We had another 24 of them over in across the harbor entrance, and another 24. So we had 48 nuclear armed missiles within a short distance from where that UFO landed. Interestingly, for New York 56, one of the launch section chiefs is the head of our association. He was actually stationed there during that 1970 event. And he said in July of 1970, or the early part of 1970, the summer of 1970, was the only time, to his knowledge, that those missiles were actually armed for flight in anger. That means they had to take out what are called safe plugs out of the nuclear warhead, and they had to put in arming plugs. And then they'd raise the missiles up to the launch area and raise them up. Like you see that one missile is in the launch position there. That was the only time in the 6 years that he was associated with New York 56 that they had ever armed those missiles. There was never any missiles launched from that area, either in training or in anger, since 1955 when they first had the Nike Ajax there. So, but that arming took place at the same time that the UFO landed and left that trace evidence in the backyard in that swampy area. Nobody knows that. The gentleman that's in charge of our association, because it was a nuclear facility, they only knew what they had to know in order to launch their missiles successfully. They were never told exactly what the reason was that they armed it. His story, and it was a fascinating story, he says they got the order to arm those missiles, and they went to launch status. They were 5 minutes away from launching that missile in anger. He said that when they got it up into that position, into the ready position, they finally apparently turned, whatever the reason was. They said it was a Tu-95 Bear bomber. They said that they had turned it, but an hour and a half took place before they finally disarmed that missile and put it back into its area. And that is not normal operating procedures for incursions by Tu-95 Bear bombers. First of all, the Nike would never have been the primary defense against it. They would have sent jet fighters out. So the story that the launch crew had was that there was a single Tu-95 Bear bomber. The reality was, though, it happened the same time as the landing in Fort Monmouth. So,
Joe,
yes.
I heard that there was a Bear bomber that crashed up in Maine or in Canada. Is that correct at about that time?
I saw an interesting, it was a science fiction movie, and it had a crash, I think either in Alaska or northwestern Canada.
Okay.
And it was carrying nuclear devices. Now, a lot of times these stories that are released as fiction, a lot of times they have some type of founding in reality. And I think that may in fact be the case here, Bruce. I have not heard formally that any Russian plane ever crashed.
Right. The Project Blue Book TV series had a show about that.
Yes,
where
that's
Hynek
where I saw
supposedly,
it.
yeah, went to that location, that crash site.
Yeah. Now, in theory, supposedly they're taking a lot of these stories out of Blue Book, but I think Blue Book is one of those things that I don't think it ever had. It never really existed to prove or it was there to disprove the UFO phenomenon. So I take it with a grain of salt. The other interesting thing is that so many stories did not get into Blue Book. There are a number, like my ship, the ship I was on, we had 3 sightings while I was on board it. One of them was formally reported, but that never made it into any report. Now, Blue Book was over by 1969. That's when I was on board, which is another story in of itself, and I will get into it a little later on, perhaps. But yeah, I'm not sure about the validity of the Russian Tu-95 Bear bomber, or if it did crash. I mean, they crashed just like all. I mean, we've lost a number of B-52s, a couple of them carrying hydrogen devices. So I mean, crashing is one thing. Whether it crashed over, Canada, well, that becomes an act of war. I mean, that's really is an act of war. See, the incursions that the Russians would make all the time on our coastal areas, they would always be flying in. They'd make a beeline towards New York City. And they would do that for a couple of reasons. They want to record the radars that were tracking them. They would want to practice their countermeasures, just like our radar operators would be doing the same thing. So as a cat and mouse game. But they would always turn, and we'd send out our fighters, put the eyeballs on them, and get them to turn. If they didn't turn, they would be shot down with an air-to-air missile. And they would always turn. So as far as Canada, though, now you're sneaking in, but there were 3 major radar lines that protected continental United States and Canada. You had the DEW line, which is the distant early warning line. And that was at the Arctic Circle, above the Arctic Circle. Then you had the Mid-Canada line, or the McGill line, and that was halfway between Canada and the Arctic Circle, or the United States and the Arctic Circle. And then across the top of continental United States, you had what was called the Pine Tree line. And that was 3 lines of defense that plane would have had a crossover and would have had to defeat. And that probably wouldn't have happened very easily. Now, if a plane crashed and it was flying over Alaska or Canada, very good chance it might have been shot down. Maybe something we wouldn't have heard about. It's a Cold War event. And I can give you an instant of another Cold War event that you didn't hear about that probably put us within minutes of World War III. So interesting times. I don't know if that answers your question, Bruce, but.
Also, another question. How long have you been working on this project? How much of this information did you know back early on in your own military career?
Okay, well, I kind of have to bifurcate here. And my life is basically divided up into 1, 2, 3, 4 segments. And each segment had something in it that was filed away for future reference. And I stress the future reference because this is kind of it's something that grows. You don't just put it down and forget about it. At least it didn't for me, because there was always something that all of a sudden was like a jigsaw puzzle piece fell into place when I was least looking for it. When I was a kid, I mean, it started out when I was about 3 years old. So UFO activity included a Brookhaven National Lab, also in a mild way, and this morphed into a couple of years ago, Camp Hero, but not Camp Hero, which is that's the Philadelphia experiment and more, but actually a small Air Force base that nobody knew anything about that was adjacent to Camp Hero. And something very interesting came out of nowhere that automatically kind of fell in, another piece that kind of at least dangled itself teasingly of maybe fleshing out more of the information about MK Ultra, mind control, experimentations, things that were of that nature, including Nike, because there's a radar piece out there that's part of the SAGE system that also adds more components to the things I've been looking at. So it hasn't been really that much of a plan. However, starting in 1958 and going through my time in the service, things started falling into place and became more apparent that there was a definite tie-in to things. And then it got more interesting. I started looking a little bit more, doing some more research. So, but it was all personal experience, though.
So you said 1968 or 58?
1958 is when I had that UFO sighting on the Navy Road, daylight
Right.
sphere. But even there, it was just an anecdotal piece of interesting tidbit until 1996, believe it or not. 1996, I was working on, we were starting an arts council, Long Branch. And one of the volunteers was an engineer that worked over at Fort Monmouth. His name was Don Griffith. Now, part of what we were trying to do, there was a theater in Long Branch. It was built by Walter Reed. And it was probably the finest theater that Walter Reed actually ended up building. And it was called the Paramount. And this gentleman that's an engineer at Fort Monmouth, he's a savant also, because he knew everything there was to know about movie theaters, movies. His collection of movie art was incredible. And his mind was like a steel trap. He was actually a consultant on Titanic. So, and he was a volunteer, and he was one heck of a volunteer to have, because he had all the historical aspects of that theater. But interestingly, one day I was talking, and somehow we got on the subject of UFOs. I said, yeah, I saw that UFO in 1958, and I told him where I saw it and how it was flying. He said, oh yeah. He said, I saw that as well. It's 1996 now. And it turns out he actually lived 5 miles closer to the Navy Pier, right off the Navy Road, about a mile off the Navy Road, in a swampy area of part of Swimming River, where Red Bank bridge goes from Red Bank into the Lincroft or River Plaza. And he said the darn thing actually landed in that swampy area. So swampy areas are something that attracts these things for whatever reason. It was the same with Bob White. His crash landing was in a swampy area, not too far from the nuclear power plant. So, and that's one of the things he first noticed, because he noticed the landing in River Plaza, also the landing in Port Monmouth, and then of course his event down in Lower Alloway Creek. So cause and effect, yeah, well, it looks like there is some cause and effect there. Anyway, I'm going to move on here. Okay, and of course this is Bob's, and I'm not trying to steal Bob's thunder, but he definitely adds some perspective to my New Jersey argument. And of course, this is a picture of the Salem 1 nuclear power plant. And the UFO was seen over in 1976. And then, of course, the crash or incident that brought down a UFO in 1991. Now, this slide, I threw this, I left this in. It actually, there was another talk that I was giving. And the only reason I left this one in, because it had most of the incidents, the major incidents, between the time I was about 3 years old, which is 1950. And in 2008, I worked for an astronaut. And this astronaut, his name is Mark Brown. He was the mission specialist on STS-48. So if you follow the interesting UFO related STS missions, space shuttle missions, 48 is the one that has objects that are taking off at angles, and another object, like it was trying to shoot it down, takes off the last seconds only. Well, anyway, Mark was my president and chief operations officer for a company I was with at the time. which was MTC, or modern, it used to be Modern Technologies. And he was my keynote speaker. I was a program manager, and I put on an event at the hotel in Long Branch, which was a conference for some teammates from my company. We were priming a large defense contract, and my teammates were other companies, small, medium, and large companies. So it was a 2-day event. And that Saturday at lunchtime, he was going to be my keynote speaker. But the problem was we were being purchased by BAE, which is a gigantic British defense contractor, and we were in negotiations. Well, Mark right after he gave his talk at lunchtime on Saturday, had to catch a flight from Newark down to Washington where he could continue negotiations with BAE. So I said, okay, well, I'll give you a ride. And of course, I knew Mark was he was on that space shuttle, that STS-48. So when I had him in the car for 35 minutes as a captive rider, I told him my story. My stories of the 3 events while I was in the military, and he brainstormed trying to figure out what they might have been. So after a while, he said, definitely sounds like it was unidentified, because there was nothing that he knew of at the time that would replicate 3 objects that flew over my ship in the middle of the Pacific Ocean at 3,500 miles per hour. So I asked him, I said, well, Mark, I said, well, what about your STS-48 mission? I said, that has a pretty well known. And that's when he said very, very pointedly, he said, look, he said, I can't tell you what they were, but I can tell you what they weren't. He said they were not frozen condensate caught in the thruster of the space shuttle. He said the objects, and he stressed this, he said there were multiple objects. And he said NASA was tracking them for over 20 minutes. And they were in conversation with the space shuttle. Mark, being the mission specialist, they told him to grab a large format camera and go to one of the shuttle windows and shoot these things as they flew past the space shuttle. He said he grabbed the camera, ran to the window. He said those damn things were moving so fast you couldn't see them, let alone get a picture of them. So I said, okay, well, that's interesting, but I never saw anything that would validate anything he told me until I looked at the forbidden Disney video, UFO disclosure video. If you go to around minute 21 and play it, you'll see Mark in the space shuttle. He has a red golf shirt on, and he has that large format camera sitting on his shoulder going to the window of the space shuttle. So that was the validation that I needed. NASA to this day says it was nothing but frozen condensate, and nobody talks about it being tracked for over 20 minutes. So that is very interesting. That's a picture of Mark up there. The other pictures on here, some of them do definitely represent New Jersey. We all know George Filer. If you go to where it says reported McGuire Fort Dix, and there's a picture of a Jeep, and you can't see much on it. It's a small chart, but that represents George's report of the alien that was shot on the unused runway and where it expired. And again, that happened in January of 1978. Now, at the time, I was an athletic director over at Fort Monmouth. And being a junior guy at the time, I ended up having to close the place up at 10 o'clock. Well, about 8 o'clock, I'm sitting there pretty much by myself in the lobby of the gym. And one of the FBI agents that I know came walking up the steps. Now, first of all, this FBI agent is one heck of a guy. He's gregarious. He was a hockey player for Boston College. He was always joking around, always laughing, just a fun guy to be around. Well, this one evening, he comes walking up the steps in January of 1978, and he looked like he had seen a ghost. His face was as white as a sheet. I even mentioned to him, I said, John, I said, you look like you've seen a ghost. What's the matter? He said, they killed someone on a military base. And then he never said another word about it, ever. I didn't think too much about it, but I did pick up the newspaper the next day, thinking that it was somebody that was breaking into Earl. Maybe they were going to try to blow up a of bunkers or something like that. There was nothing in any of the papers about anybody being shot, killed on a military base. Well, it was several years later when I saw George's story, and I started putting two and two together. And said, but the guy disappeared. I can't find him. I looked all over the place for him. And then 2 years ago, Bruce Pearson, whom you all know from these Zoom sessions, Bruce has a friend who is a pilot. Bruce is a pilot too. And this pilot was retired. He retired from the Air Force, the CIA, and as a civilian pilot. And he got very sick, and he's on in years. But he told Bruce that he was in the Air Force, or he flew into McGuire Air Force Base the morning of that incident. And he said that they were getting off the plane, or they were getting ready to get off the plane after landing. It was early morning, and the plane taxied up the tarmac to where they would disembark. And the air traffic control automatically, or pretty soon, they got on the radio and told them, do not deplane until we tell you to. So the crew had to stay on that plane, not knowing exactly what was going on, but they stayed on the plane, and somebody decided to change the frequency of one of their radios, that they were able to tap into the air police frequency. And they heard all the chatter apparently about the alien being shot. So, and again, this is that synchronicity. The initial report took place 1978, roughly. And then there was some corroboration in 1988. And then finally, in like 2017, all of a sudden we have this other thing where a pilot added more to the story. So that's the reason you can't just forget about these things. You kind of have to keep your ear to the track, so to speak, because you never know what's going to show up. So basically that's it. There were other things in here that were not New Jersey related, but they were related to my ship. We had a USO event in Vietnam. Whatever it was swam right underneath the ship while we were holding swim call. So it was about 100 foot long, about 35 foot wide. We have no clue what it was. So I'm going to move on. There was the drive-in movie theater. That was another one. But again, that was early iteration stuff. And here's here's what it is. Basically, at the drive-in theater, we saw a zigzagging white light, very fast zigzagging white light that disappeared behind the screen of a movie outdoor theater in Bridgehampton, out Long Island. And it was in the direction of Brookhaven National Lab. So this is just a rendition of what it looks like, and that's a picture of Brookhaven National Lab, which is about 30 miles to the west. Okay, Camp Hero. Now this here, there's a lot of rumor and innuendo that went along with this one. This is a big concrete blockhouse out there in Camp Hero, and it's called the Sage Building. And this means it was a major node for a early computer network. The radar on top is one of two radars that have been deployed around the country. Very powerful. They were state of the art at the time. They would still be used today, but they don't need them. That was left up there. They took the motor away, and they took the control mechanism away and let it free swing in the wind. And it's left there because fishermen use it as a navigation aid. This is out in Montauk. And this is on top of a number of the bunkers that do exist that we don't know exactly what they were, unless you go along with the stories that are out there, MK Ultra and all that stuff. So, but the interesting thing here is not so much this building or even Camp Hero per se. Another interesting incident took place when we were giving a tour out there at that Nike site out on Sandy Hook. I had finished up a tour, but tour is about 45 minutes. And I finished up my one tour, and I go back and I was talking to one of my buddies there, and he was talking to somebody that was there for one of the other tours. And we started talking, and it turns out this guy said something very, very interesting. Somehow we started talking about the radars and things like that. And he mentioned that he used to go with the base commander of the Air Force station out there and had a runway. But the problem is, I couldn't find anything that said that they had actually were flying missions out there. But what this guy told me, he said that the woman that ran the base was a lieutenant colonel. And he said it was his girlfriend. So he said that the interesting thing was that her degree, she had advanced degrees in psychology. I said, okay, well, why is the advanced degree in psychology? Why is she running an air installation like that? And then he said that what they were doing, they took pilots that had some type of psychological stress, maybe crashing their plane, having to bail out or something like that. He was very specific about this. He said what they did, part of their rehabilitation, they sent them out to this place where they would get into an F-16 and they would fly. Kind of like, when you fall off the horse, you get back on. I said, well, that's kind of interesting, especially with all the MK Ultra rumors going around about that site. Well, I started doing a lot of reading, and I could find absolutely nothing about anything like that, not even an acknowledgement that there were flying planes out there until 1981 when they shut the facility down, turned it over to the Air National Guard, and then they turned it over to the New York Park System. So it's kind of a mystery, but the thing that's really mysterious is that it touches on psychology, and it also is something that you can't validate any component of that. And what the guy said, he said the woman, he was going with her. And for whatever reason, they decided to break up at the time that she took her new position, which is back at a small installation back in Los Angeles. I tried finding that out. I tried finding out where they had psychological reconditioning for pilots and things. Absolutely nothing on it. And he didn't go. And he said that she went and took over that installation. So if the guy is telling the truth, he just divulged something that nobody else knows. And if he's not telling the truth, well, it's a lot less interesting than the stories that have been swirling around Camp Hero, in the Philadelphia experiment and all that good stuff. I'm going to stop here. Any comments, concerns, ideas? Okay, I'm going to move on to the next one. And again, this is just this is Doorbrook Park, the crop circle, and then the arrows again. Nothing. This one here, it's another rendition of that. Same thing with this one, and this one, and that one. Okay, now back to the reason that nukes seem to be of great interest. These two maps represent two things. Okay, the map on the right shows the area that think tanks all decided were prime target areas for Russian missiles and bomber attacks. Okay, the one on the left is the distribution of Nike sites around the country. And if you look at from Washington all the way up to Massachusetts, the blue is solid line of blue on the East Coast, and it's a solid line of black on the East Coast for the prime targets. So that's the reason they have a dense concentration of Nike sites. They were Ajax first, then to be replaced by the nuclear-armed Nike Hercules missiles. Going on, and again, same thing, same. This one is a map, maybe some of you have seen it already, but this is the distribution of triangles, flying triangles around the country. And if you look at the overlays, see that it pretty much replicates the Nike distribution, the target evaluation, and also the density of UFO sightings.
Joe,
Specifically the triangles. Yes.
that map on the upper right was generated at National Institute for Discovery Science when I was there.
Okay.
It's back in 2004. Just want to let you know.
Okay, now that was pretty accurate as of 2004, as far as reported sightings, correct?
Correct. It was from 4 different databases
Oh,
combined.
okay, okay. Have you ever seen the other distributions for the Nike or the targeting?
No, I have not.
Okay, I thought it was just kind of interesting because one kind of validated the other, so, and
Right.
again, how that works, I'm not exactly sure. But
Yeah.
you notice
or-
up there, up there in the Northeast, the flying triangles are very densely packed up in that area.
Are they aliens investigating our military facilities, or are they, some military ARV doing reconnaissance in those areas?
I'd say that they're probably very interested, again, with the overlay of the target areas. In the Midwest, you see those big splotches. Those big splotches are the concentrations of our ballistic missiles. Okay,
Right.
so we have all those missile batteries up there. And then, of course, on the West Coast, kind of surprised me about the West Coast is you don't have near the amount of interesting areas that you do on the East Coast, other than San Francisco and Los Angeles, and I guess down to San Diego, because there's a lot of military out there. It's just maybe not all that nuclear. Not all that stuff is nuclear. Of course, San Diego is a major Navy base, and they have aircraft carriers. That's where the Nimitz is home ported. And of course, the sightings that they have, and they do carry nukes as part of their complement. So, yeah, I'm going to say that the UFOs, they have the same intel that we do, maybe even better, and that they know where they want to look. And apparently, they were actually looking where at those areas. So there's another interesting thing too, and that's the space fence. And I think it's like at the 32nd parallel or 34th parallel. And that's where the Navy years ago put up a radar picket line, roughly at that level, going from I think Tennessee all the way out to Nevada. And now they're updating the thing. They're widening the beam so they can pick up more space objects that are coming into or going out of the atmosphere. So that's taking place, I think, again on the 32nd, 31st parallel. And that covers areas like Area 51, Dulce, and so on. What that cause and effect is, I'm not sure. Why the DoD is looking in that area. They do a lot of really interesting observations. The Navy also has electro-optical devices at 3 locations around the Earth. One in Hawaii, one in Socorro, New Mexico, and another one in Diego Garcia out in the Indian Ocean. And these are very sophisticated devices that you can see things like golf balls in space. Just like our X-band radars that they deployed as part of the Missile Defense Initiative, the SDI, that thing can tell the direction a golf ball is spinning 140 miles up in space. So they're looking in space very specifically for whatever is of importance. Obviously, it seems like there should be some interest in the UFO activity because it happens on such a wide basis, especially sightings from the space station, so on. Anybody have any ideas about that, or? Okay, I'm going to move on. And of course, there's a Nike Hercules missile, flies at Mach 3.5, has a range of about 100 miles, surface ceiling of about 170,000 feet. Very capable, rocket radar guided. And on the other side, that's a Nike Ajax. This is out at New York, part of our exhibit out there in Sandy Hook. We have a couple of missiles, and we have the battery control van fully lighted, and the radars all look like they work. And if you have a chance to get out to Sandy Hook, I suggest coming out there and checking the schedule to see when we have a free, and these are all free. They're free tours. And this, okay, down in the lower right-hand corner, just to give you an idea, that device, that shiny silver-colored device, is what's called a barrow probe. And that sits on top of a Nike Hercules missile and has two wires coming out of the end of it that go into a control box in the missile that controls the warhead itself. The barrow probe actually measures the barometric pressure that's preset in the warhead, so that when it reaches a certain altitude, the final arming device of that warhead is when it reaches that altitude based upon the barometric pressure. The other things are pretty straightforward, but these are our radars that we light up and we can show different various things on them. That's the battery control van where they would launch the missile from. That's a missile tracking radar operator. He tracks the missile, but also that tracking provides the telemetry to control the missile to the intercept. That's a target ranging and target tracking radar. And that's the IFC itself out on Sandy Hook. That's a high power radar. And that's the actual launcher area where we had 24 of those missiles. Okay, now that's pretty much it for the New Jersey portion of this. There is a lot more, but I don't have direct knowledge of it other than what I read. So what I tried to do, I tried to keep it as real as I could and give you kind of as much as from the first person singular perspective as possible. This one here is basically my ship and the activities, well, the lower portion. But the upper portion was UFOs that have been sighted by the Navy long before the Nimitz images were made public. The images up there were taken through a periscope on a nuclear submarine, Trepang, and that was 1970. And they were actually taken out of the water and then flying back into the water. I have the one in the lower right-hand corner. You might recognize that. That was the Glomar Explorer. Everybody knows the Glomar Explorer? Okay, the Glomar Explorer was built by Howard Hughes for the CIA. And it was
Wasn't that to
designed,
recover a sunken sub?
yeah,
The
K-129. Yep. It was designed to raise the K-129. Interestingly, now, if you want to talk about conspiracies, I've got a great conspiracy to throw out for you. Okay, in 1968, the K-129 sank in 16,000 feet of water in the Pacific Ocean. The U.S. Navy knew almost exactly where it went down when it sank, because the underwater listening devices they had all over the ocean, even in 1968, they were able to triangulate and identify the area where the sub was. The Russians, on the other hand, had no clue where they knew their sub was lost after about 2 weeks, but they had no clue where. And it turns out that sub was on a course that it shouldn't have been on, which is interesting in of itself. Now, it's a ballistic missile submarine, not nuclear, but it was carrying 3 ballistic missiles. And interestingly, it was this class of submarine, a Gulf II submarine, was being sold to the Chinese at the time. And if you remember, in 1968, Russia and China had a hot war going on their common border. They were shooting at each other. Yet they were still turning over several of these submarines to the Chinese. This was the 4th and last of the subs that were going over. And it came back from its ballistic missile patrol off the coast of Oregon. It was only in port for 1 month before it had orders to put out to sea again. It put out to sea from, it wasn't Vladivostok, but there was a submarine base. And when it went out to sea, it actually left with 10 additional people on it. Okay, now, normally you have about 90 people in the crew. You add another 10 people to it, you've just significantly increased the number or the impact on the air and food and things like that, and water. Very compact. It was a pig boat, basically, that was carrying nuclear weapons. Anyway, the submarine instead of going back on its patrol off the coast of Oregon, was making a beeline towards Honolulu, towards Hawaii. And where it ended up sinking was exactly at the range of its missile, which was about 1,000 nautical miles. And it sank not too far from a place called French Frigate Shoals. Now, the Navy knew where it was. They were able to go out and put eyes on it. They located it. And in 1968, Popular Mechanics did an article about the Glomar Explorer, that they were planning on building the ship to mine magnesium nodules off the ocean floor as a cover story. And Howard Hughes was building this. If anybody could build the darn thing, it was Howard Hughes. And he, sure enough, he built the darn thing. And he had another ship that was similar to it. It's called the Challenger, Glomar Challenger, for Global Marine. Well, anyway, in 1970, I had just come back from Vietnam. My ship was home ported in Honolulu, right across from Aloha Tower. And we were getting ready to go out on the Ocean Station Victor, which was about halfway to Japan, and where we'd spend 45 days out there and so on. Well, anyway, just before, about 2 weeks before we were to leave, Glomar Explorer pulled up in front of us and anchored at Sand Island. Nice, big, brand new ship, brand spanking new. Everything on it was bright. And we were getting ready to take the Liberty launch over to Honolulu, which was right across the harbor entrance. And we get onto the Liberty boat, Liberty launch, and the coxswain said, "Mind if I take a little detour? I want to take a look at this ship." And so sure enough, he cruised all the way down the side of it, and we turned around astern of it. And across the back, I swear I saw Glomar Explorer. I knew what it was because I remember the Popular Mechanics article. Ship leaves, we go out on patrol, come back, and then in 1977, 1978, a video came out. Stan, I don't know if are you familiar with the video? Okay, it was called Project Azorian. You could see it. It's out on the internet right now. Anyway, Project Azorian came out, and it was this professionally done video, and it was produced by the CIA. Okay, very professionally done. Everything was, bright and clear. It's nice storyline, great images and all this stuff. Well, it turns out what they said in the video, that the Glomar Explorer wasn't launched until 1972. So what am I looking at in 1970? I swear it said Glomar Explorer on it. So I didn't think anything more of it until I started thinking. I said, wait a minute, there's more to the story than, what was released. First of all, they wanted to bring up the submarine, which broke apart, of course, when it sank in 16,000 feet. It was in basically two parts. But the first part had the conning tower. And the conning tower had the 3 ballistic missiles in it. And they wanted to bring up that portion of the sub. And so I'm sitting there and said, it costs a lot of money to bring that submarine up just for a couple of nuclear warheads. It didn't make sense really. Code books still didn't make sense. So anyway, they started raising it. And all of a sudden, lo and behold, one of the arms of the lifting mechanism, which was a claw, broke, and they dropped the conning tower back to the bottom. Now, they already discovered that there was radioactivity when they went down. But the interesting thing is, when they only brought up the front section with a couple of torpedoes and maybe some code books and a couple of bodies, which they gave a Navy funeral to. So I'm still trying to figure out, it didn't make sense. Why try to bring up that submarine, that particular submarine, when there were other subs that they could have gone after that might have had more interesting stuff on them? Then it dawned on me. There was a movie that came out a couple of years ago, and it had the premise that a submarine had gone rogue, but it hadn't gone rogue by the crew. It went rogue by the KGB. And what they wanted to do, they wanted to fire one of their missiles at the United States, and somehow it would get blamed on the Chinese. and it would start a nuclear war between China and the United States. I think what made sense was if the CIA wanted to bring that submarine up, maybe they wanted to find out if somebody tried to launch one of those missiles without the proper codes. If you don't have the proper code, it would have self-destructed in the tube, which is located in the conning tower, and the fire would have sunk the submarine. I think that's what they were looking for. They wanted to validate that, that was the case and not something else. Thoughts? Anybody have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is wild, and I don't really have the video link, but this is ringing some bells for me. Do you know Dark Journalist?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So this is somehow connected. The Howard Hughes thing is somehow connected with what he calls the hot zone, which is kind of like in the Bahamas, the Bermuda Triangle area. And I know he's done a show on this, but I cannot remember what show it was. He has a series called the X series. As I remember, he was saying that this incident was a cover for something going on in the hot zone, and that's all I remember. So if you're interested, you have to trawl through Dark Journalist.
Okay, Dark Journalist. I will definitely do that, because like I said, to me, it doesn't pass the sniff test. The story that we get from one side, or even the movie was diverted a little bit, and it made it a little bit more paranormal than, maybe factual. But the questions about that submarine sinking and where it ended up sinking has been quite a mystery, at least for most of us. Thanks for sharing that, Susan. Appreciate it. Anybody else? Bruce, you got anything, or? Okay.
When were all these pictures taken from? Oh, excuse me. When were these pictures taken from the periscopes on the Trepang?
These have been out on the web for some time. And the interesting thing about them, not that you can actually validate that they're official Navy photos, it's just that they have never refuted them. Nobody has refuted them, including the skipper of the Trepang. So it's one of those things that falls into an area that could be considered somewhat gray. But again, knowing what I know about what you will see if you spend any time at sea, it doesn't surprise me in the least, in that there are strange things that you will see. I can almost guarantee it. To give you an example, the third event on my ship, I was a navigator. And so I was out shooting morning stars with my captain, the officer of the deck, and my chief. And we were out on the starboard bridge when we were heading back from Guam back to Hawaii. And it was early morning, about 5:30 in the morning. You shoot stars a half hour before sunrise, so you don't have the sun glaring at you, but it's like daylight, so you have a good horizon. And so we're out on the starboard bridge wing, and we're steaming, maybe making 14 knots. And all of a sudden in front of us, beautiful day, beautiful summer-like South Pacific weather. All of a sudden in front of us was this gigantic silver sphere. Now, we're not too far from the Marianas Trench. We're about 2 days out from the Marianas Trench. And we see this sphere, and it's flying straight at us. It's on basically a reciprocal course. And so we all drop our sextants and our stopwatches and everything, and we're watching this thing. And it passed us on the port side of the ship, very close, maybe a couple 100 yards off. And we were on the starboard side. And my captain was the senior captain in the Coast Guard. He was an 06, senior 06, would never make admiral because he was not an academy man, but he was a master mariner. He could sail any ship, any place in the world. And so we're looking, and we had already reported 3 UFOs on my first ocean station patrol during the Apollo 11 mission. And again, portion of the Pacific, a couple 100 miles north of where the Apollo 11 was going to set down. Anyway, so I'm expecting the captain to say, okay, we'll write up a sit rep and send it off. Follow procedures like we did for the 3 that flew over us. All he did was shrug his shoulders and went back to shooting morning stars. He had spent 30 some years at sea, and he Mustanged it all the way from E1 all the way up to 06. He had seen it all. There was nothing that surprised him. And that's what surprised me, that this was a very unique, this was very similar to the silver UFO that I saw flying along the Navy Road. Very similar, except it didn't have any flashing lights on it. So, I mean, you see stuff. And I was only on 20 months. I was only on board that ship 20 months. So, and we had 3 sightings, 1 USO and 2 UFO. 1 daylight or 2 daylight, 1 late at night. So that's all I can say. And so the Trepang to me is one of those stories that definitely passes a sniff test. And the fact that they also have protocols in place that the sonar operators on not only American submarines, but on Russian submarines, they have protocols that they have to follow for reporting anything that they discover underwater. And that's all the time. They're hearing high-speed sound of vessels that are doing hundreds of knots an hour underwater. I mean, our fastest thing is a torpedo that maybe goes 80 or 90 miles per hour. So we know things are down there. They don't report them as such. They're logged very quietly. And that was absolutely observed by a consultant that was going out on sea trials on one of the submarines. And they had a contact like that. So, draw from what you will. Sorry, I'm rambling on again. So, anybody like to, shall we start a conversation, or would somebody like to throw something out that they think would be something of interest to discuss? It's now 3:30, so.
Is this presentation going to be put on the internet?
Yeah.
That's great, because it's a very good history lesson.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, getting these things exactly right. I wanted to edit them so that they looked a little bit less amateurish, but the editing software that I haven't got the skill level to use it yet. I was hoping Stanley could help. Anyway, yeah, it's going to be put up there, Bruce.
It amazes me that I lived only a few miles from you when I was living in Red Bank.
Yep.
And my wife, Pat Huffcornet, she had married a military man there at Fort Monmouth. And the other interesting thing, the connection, is that when she was 8 or 9 years old, which would have been at about 1957, 58, she was living with her parents at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base as a child. And she claims that she had been abducted and taken to ET classes aboard their ships during that period of time when she was there. And it always amazed me that, okay, that, the ETs could come right in and take somebody, and the military wouldn't even know what was happening.
I mean, right there at Wright-Patterson?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, Wright-Patterson is a very interesting place. That company that I worked for, that astronaut, we were very Air Force centric. A matter of fact, our corporate headquarters was in Dayton, Ohio. And the bulk of the engineering work that we did, we had a whole bunch of people that were there at the Air Force research labs and various other facilities there at Wright-Pat. So it's it's an interesting base for sure. A lot of interesting work has been done there over the years too, although much of it we may never know about.
Well, did you read the book, Tell My Story, about June Crawford? It was written by Jim Clarkson, who is a MUFON representative in Washington, I believe. And June, just before she died, revealed her a story about what she encountered and was responsible for, as in charge of all the classified information at the Wright-Patterson. And she confirmed a lot of stuff that people had been speculating about.
I believe even bodies. She mentioned alien bodies too, didn't she?
Yes, yes, she did.
Yeah.
She handled the tin foil or aluminum foil, whatever it was, that could be crinkled up and then would resume its shape. And she even said that they had a whole contingency of paperclip Nazis living there too.
Oh, well, that's another thing. I didn't even mention that. At Evans area out there in Wall Township, part of Fort Monmouth, we had 58 paperclip engineers, scientists, and mathematicians, and so on. Matter of fact, the first satellite that we had ended up putting up, it's kind of an interest, about the size of a grapefruit. And there was a big fight that broke out between the paperclip engineers and the Fort Monmouth American engineers. The American engineers wanted to use a battery to power the small radio transmitter. The paperclip engineers said, no, why should we do that? We have access to, solar cells now. They were just developed. They ended up winning the argument, and they ended up putting solar cells on that satellite. We actually have one of the satellites at the Project Diana, the facility that I work the antenna at. And it's interesting just to find out, to see how simple the darn thing was. If you take it apart, the radio is almost like a kid building a transistor, one of those early transistor kits. Yet the thing would send out the beeps, and the satellite that's up there right now is going to be up there for another 400 years. And this is one of its sister devices. Yeah, so project, matter of fact, interestingly, one of the physicists, we had I'm going to call it a nuclear reactor, even though it wasn't a reactor in the common sense out there in Wall Township. And it was basically a big tank filled with water, and at the bottom of it had what was called the reactor. And the water was used to dampening the radiation. Well, the scientist that was in charge of that reactor used to go swimming in the tank with the admonition, anybody else that goes swimming in there, just don't go below 10 feet because the radiation was so high. And that's a true story. So that reactor was there. We didn't know anything about it for years. And right now, all of a sudden, I'm finding out all this stuff that was going on at Fort Monmouth post World War II. Of course, that's where we bounced the first signal off the moon, January 10th, 1946, using radar that was developed right there, part of the radar lab. And that was done in conjunction with Western Electric Bell Labs. So, yeah, a lot of interesting things in the area. That was the point I was trying to make with this. And even there, I couldn't put everything in because a lot of the stuff I just don't even have good anecdotal data on. I'm hoping to come across people that may have that type of information. One person, everybody knows who Ivan Sanderson was, right? Ivan Sanderson, he had an organization called SITU, Society for the Investigation of the Unexplained. He was on Long John Neville. He was on all these big shows back in the 50s and 60s. He was also a scientist himself. He was a biologist. And his association, he was one of the first in the UFO community to actually use scientific, protocols to try to investigate everything. He was one of the first to investigate the Sasquatch. He was one of the first to investigate a lot of the ancient alien type stuff. Very interesting guy. Well, there was a guy that worked with my father at Bendix, and he was an engineer, and his name was Bob Worth. Bruce, you might have come across him when he lived in Little Silver, probably less than a mile from where you lived.
I think I heard about him. Yes.
Yeah. Well, Bob was an engineer. He was friends with my father, and I never met him until later on. But Bob was also he and his wife Nancy were the chief investigators. And they also published Pursuit, which was Sanderson's journal that came out quarterly. And Sanderson died in like 1976 of cancer. But they kept this organization going until like 1991, and they produced Pursuit until that time. Then when Bob died suddenly of something, and he had what was remaining of all the research work that Sanderson had at his institute, and he stored it in a concrete blockhouse. It had a door, it was a garage basically, with no garage door. It was just a single steel door, and everything was locked away there. And Nancy, after Bob passed, she didn't know what to do with all this stuff. I said, well, maybe we can find somebody that could use it for research. You know, it's a lot of good research material. And then I didn't see her for about 6 months or so. Then I found out she had turned it over to somebody, along with the remaining $50,000 that was in the not-for-profit in the corporation. And the stuff, I was assured that it went into good hands and that it's stored someplace in a barn up in Minnesota or something. So, but unfortunately, all that stuff, I have a copy of every one of the Pursuit magazines. Like I said, a lot of interesting stuff. A lot of interesting people were on his board too, including the biggest debunker in the history of UFOs. He was on the board.
Carl Klaas.
Yeah, he was on the board. So, but Bob did a lot of good work. He did the research on that the landing there in Port Monmouth as well. Anyway, without beating a horse too badly, I came to the end of my presentation. I was actually thinking about showing the video by Harlan Bentley, who was the radar operator at the Nike site down in Olney Durwood, Maryland. He's part of the Disclosure project. So would everybody like to see that video if I can get it queued up?
Sure.
Okay.
Yep.
Let me.
Okay.
Okay. Anybody see that?
I was in the United States Army for 2 years, drafted, and then I got out of the military, went to college, and graduated in 1963 with a BSW degree. Since then, I have been in a graduate program for nuclear engineering. Also,
Can you make it louder?
I will try. No, that looks like as loud as I can get it.
For NASA, Department of Energy, and several other electronic firms in the Washington, D.C. area. In 1957 to 59, I was mostly in outside of Albany, Maryland, just north of Washington, D.C., at a Nike Ajax missile facility. I was a radar operator. In May of 1958, about 6 a.m., and the reason I knew it was 6 is because that's when everybody got up. I looked out the window. At first I heard a sound. It sounded like a pulsating transformer. I looked out the window and looked across the field and saw this object.
We lost the audio.
I'm sorry, did you say something?
We lost the audio for a while.
Oh, okay.
Radar,
Okay.
and looked at the pieces that were laying across the field. And the largest piece that I saw, which was actually glowing white hot, was probably the size of a washing machine. shortly thereafter, the Air Force personnel had arrived going across this field and started picking up these pieces. Now they used long poles, very long poles, to pick up the biggest piece, and they proceeded to put it on a truck that was lead line truck and pushed it in with another long pole and got it inside the truck itself. Then the other personnel picked up the other pieces that were laying about. Now, what's interesting about it is from my knowledge of nuclear things now, I recall that these personnel were wearing radiation suits, protective suits, and then they proceeded to take the material away. Have no idea where it went. The other issue there was that when the craft took off again after it crashed, it went through a grove of trees, which it actually sheared 3, 4, 5-inch limbs in just one fell swoop, like a knife or a machete. Well, that wasn't the real exciting part. The real exciting part happened the next evening while I was on duty, and it was approximately 10, 11 at night. And I got a call from the Gaithersburg facility saying that they had 12 to 15 UFOs 50 to 100 feet off the ground. So I asked the guy who was on the radio with me, I said, what do they sound like? He took his head mic off, put it out the van window, and again, the pulsating sound, except there were more of them. And he was describing them and in different shapes and so forth. I had the radar on, the M33 radar, sweep radar, and I found right next to the ground clutter where Gaithersburg sits, I found the blip where these vehicles were. And then all of a sudden they all took off at the same time. And from my radar scope, it went one sweep. It's a 33 1/3 RPM. To go that distance from the center out to where I got the next blip in the first sweep at a constant velocity would have to be 17,000 miles an hour, which we calculated from our analog computer. It was probably in excess of 30 feet in diameter. It had circular balls that appeared on the outer rim up close to a cake-like fixture on top. And they were different colors. They were orange and red and some yellow, but they were pulsating. So, I mean, it was quite a sight to see as it was wobbling towards the earth and hit. And it came in at a fairly rapid rate.
How far away was it from?
Where it crashed, well, it came actually over top of the barracks. So I actually saw the tail end of where it crashed was approximately 2,000 yards. And the reason I know that is because it paralleled the launch pad, which is 2,000 yards away. There was one individual on guard duty who actually saw it come in and went over top of him. And the guard shack was just a few yards away from the barracks. And he saw that actually come down and crash all the way from when it first appeared.
You said the retrieval was apparently by Air Force.
The Air Force, yes, it was outside the fences of the radar area and also the launch pad. So it was in the civilian area, landed in this person's cornfield. In fact, the farmer was actually standing there washing his hands when he saw it crash and take off again. It's near Mount Zion, Maryland. It's just on the other side of Mount Zion, going east. I do know that the article hit the New York Times the next day.
What year was it?
58, May of 58. Directive came down not to mention this to anybody anyway. But it, of course, by this time it was already out in newspapers. What did occur was when I tracked the next night, I tracked those vehicles that were taking off. There was a question as to what they really were, and the general came back and said, well, those were helicopters, and they were doing some Navy, Army, Air Force maneuvers.
that was,
And we all had a big laugh about that one. That was the cover story used, yes. And obviously there were other people had radars on it. They actually saw those go off also. I had another one, which I can't say too much about. I can't say where I was. I was at a facility in California. That's all I can say. And I was doing particular classified work, set aside from what was actually happening there. It was a completely different scenario. The only thing I can say is it was occurring at the same time that our astronauts were doing a loop around the moon and back again. On their trip to that moon, or to the moon itself, I heard the expression of the bogey coming in at 11 o'clock. Well, familiar with that particular term, I perked my ears and started listening a little bit, and discovered that Houston and the astronauts were talking back and forth about a collision. And the astronauts asked for permission to do avoidance for a collision, and Houston finally granted that permission to do that. And after the comm link settled down a little bit, the astronauts said it's not necessary. They are now paralleling our course, and there was a discussion as to what was paralleling that course. There was another type of ship. There were portals there that you could see in. They could see beings of some sort. They did not describe these beings. They just took photographs. And after a while, a few thousand miles, and then they took off from the capsule that they were flying in and went away. They just said it was saucer-like craft, yes.
that was paralleling their thing.
Actually paralleling their craft. And it was just far enough away they couldn't really distinguish. They saw movement, they saw somebody moving inside that ship. This is before the landing, yes. It was probably in 68, 67, maybe, somewhere in that time frame. All they said was, there they go. And they went out of sight almost immediately from their conversation. It was unedited because of where I was. Extremely restricted chat. As a matter of fact, when I was doing work at NASA, I got into the NASA library looking for the tapes. Never did find them. There's only one gentleman there that said I shouldn't. No, he said, like, you didn't hear anything. And I said, hear what? That was into that. In fact, the gentleman was very disturbed I was even there for what I was doing. A bogey is when you're flying is an object coming in, and normally during World War II they used those, and also Korean War, as a term for potential enemy craft approaching. And if they don't know the aircraft type, they call it a bogey. Approximately halfway to the moon. On the way to the moon, yes. Their reactions were somewhat stoic. No big thing. And then go, wow, look at that. Look what I'm seeing. No, nothing like that at all. They just said the bogey's next to us and they're fine. Very professional. Not surprising. I don't know what instrumentation they particularly had, but they knew at their course they were going to intersect. No question about it. So they must have had some device that would tell them that. It's obvious in space, I would imagine.
Very good Turkish friends. Scuba diving with him. He would talk about the eastern part of Turkey being a great.
Okay, well, what did you think of that?
That was wonderful. I'd never heard that story before in such detail.
Yeah. And again, like I said, I kind of tripped over it. I would never have paid any attention to this probably because I ended up doing all that volunteer work out at the Nike site. So everything he was talking about, I can validate. I can validate the radar he worked on. He described perfectly. The launcher area is always about 2,000 yards, 1 nautical mile from the integrated fire control. The guy was the real deal. Now that story, interestingly, one thing he didn't talk about, and this one I found out by doing some research on it, that was Whiskey 93. Whiskey 93 is the designation for that particular battery. When they were they did after 1958. Now remember, the explosion on my site, New York 53, was also May of 1958. Well, after that blew up, they decided to do away with Nike Ajax missiles. They started replacing them all with their upgraded nuclear capable Nike Hercules. So what they were doing, the sites that were not being converted over to Hercules were being decommissioned and then either sold off or given to the local towns or whatever. Interestingly, all the sites have been declassified, moved on, buried, whatever they're going to do, turned into parks and so on. That particular site in 1966 was turned over to FEMA. And FEMA is using it to this day as a classified communications center. So it's kind of interesting that they have some type of a nuclear contamination that showed up, an event such as that, and now it's been continued as a government installation, classified government installation. I found that kind of an interesting aside. With as many of these batteries that are out there over the years, this one was kept online, so to speak. So I found that quite interesting. Any
How did you
thoughts
find
about-
this?
Pardon
How
me?
did you find this interview? The interview that you just played for us.
Oh, I was looking at all types of stuff that was Nike. There's a lot of information out there about Nike. A lot of videos. We have videos about our site. Matter of fact, even interestingly, before I got involved in it, Weird New Jersey did an article, and they also did a video on it. Not for any special reason other than it's a relic of the Cold War type of deal. However, now that it's been tied in, Sandy Hook's been tied in for years with UFOs, especially in 1951. They had the UFO sightings, radar sightings, pilots following a UFO that ended up going over Red Bank as well. Sandy Hook, Red Bank, and Wall Township. So, I'm sorry?
May I comment? May
Yeah,
I comment?
sure. Yep.
I was out on the seawall there near the point, and one evening, and a black triangle appeared from left to right or north to south, and flying at about the same level that commercial aircraft fly, coming towards Kennedy, and going the opposite direction. And as it flew by, I was videotaping the whole thing, and it's on one of my websites. The triangle turned sideways, so you saw its flat bottom, and with its multiple lights on it, it started flashing patterns of lights, and flashed and flashed and flashed as it passed. And then I realized that it was flying right in the direction of oncoming air traffic, and I saw it immediately turn out to sea and disappear. And then a commercial airplane came by, going in the opposite direction, and that was very weird. And that was near Seabright, New Jersey.
Okay. You know, it's interesting. There was a plane crash in 1997. Happened about 10 o'clock in the morning. And I was coming across the bridge, the old Highlands Bridge into Seabright, heading towards the ocean.
Mhm.
And at 10 o'clock in the morning, I'm watching this small, low wing, all silver airplane with a single propeller flying at a high rate of speed, about 50 feet off the water. And it was overcast. It was kind of a cloudy day, overcast. Apparently it was raining in some areas too. Anyway, this plane goes all of a sudden into a steep climb, does a complete loop over, and flies at high speed directly into the water. Probably about 150, 160 miles per hour.
Oh my God.
Yeah, it was a fatal. I mean, I knew it was fatal as soon as I saw the thing. But it was in the middle of the summer. It was right off the fishing beach at Sandy Hook, a couple 100 yards offshore. And they said, somebody saw that. it's being reported. The Coast Guard's out there. They'll have somebody on scene. And I was rushing to get to a meeting. Well, anyway, I get to the meeting, and then I not forgot about it totally, but I started looking in the newspapers over the next couple of days, and there was nothing in any of the newspapers. I said, well, that's strange. And then I did forget about it. And then a couple of years ago, I'm out there volunteering out at Sandy Hook, and I was talking to one of the rangers that was there for a long time. I said, what about that plane crash that happened back in '97? He said, what plane crash? I said, the plane crash right offshore, right off the fishing beach. He didn't know anything about it. So I checked out with the Coast Guard out there. They have a major installation out on Sandy Hook. They didn't know anything about it. I said, well, this is really getting weird now. Either that or I'm going crazy. I've lost my mind. I thought I saw something and I didn't. Well, anyway, so I asked a friend of mine who's on the FAA. He's on a strike team for the FAA, 747 pilot. He checked. FAA didn't seem to know anything about it, at least according to him. So I'm going on, I'm trying to track it down, and it's getting flakier and flakier. Finally, I came across a report, an FAA report, but it had the plane going down in the wrong area. It was like 7 or 8 miles from where the plane actually hit. And all they found was one wing and some debris, a seat cushion. And also there was never any name of the pilot that was killed. So like I said, that was very strange in that area. And according to the FAA, what the FAA told this friend of mine, he said that they would know if something went down because they have sensors in the water, because of submarines and things like that. And a crash of that nature probably would have shown up seismically. So, but that was kind of a strange thing. And there was only one quarter. It turned out there was one quarter paragraph in the New York Times back in '97 that had something about a plane crash. So strange stuff out there. Been
Yes,
strange for
I have
years
to
too.
agree.
Yeah.
Did I tell you about the missile attack on a TWA commercial airline that turned coming in from the sea over Seabright and then was following the canal route towards Kennedy? I was videotaping it from a little platform out on the side of Seabright, and with the bridge in view, and the TWA flight flew over the bridge and was heading toward the north. And all of a sudden, this missile comes from the sea and just passes right over the top of the plane. And it fortunately malfunctioned. There was a flash coming out of the area of the nose of the missile, which turned it downwards, and it went flying right into the intercoastal waterway there, splashing down. And it was all on tape. And I contacted the FBI because that was only a year after the TWA flight had 800 had exploded, taking off from Kennedy. And I immediately got the FBI agent laughing at me, say, yeah, sure, we get all these calls all the time. So I contacted the security at Kennedy, and they were very interested in it. And the security agent asked me to send him a copy of the tape, which I did. And I didn't hear anything from about 7 to 10 days. And then suddenly I get this phone call. He says, I can't believe what you videotaped. He said, we've been playing that over and over again, and it just is blowing our minds. And says, you're going to get a call from an FBI agent. They're coming to interview you. And they did. And the team that investigated the Flight 800 actually interrogated me.
Okay. Well, if somebody shot the 800 down, they could have been trying to before and they just failed, Now the 800 was kind of an interesting one because it ended up being a flight to Paris. Initially, I think it was scheduled to go direct to Israel. I was talking to one of the TWA pilots, and he gave me the information on it. And So if somebody tried to bring down another plane, well, that's the thing that's surprising is that they would have initially laughed at the report, especially, well, some people that for the 800, they still haven't interviewed the people that said that they saw a missile being launched or two missiles or something.
Right. Yeah, I
How
talked to
do you
somebody.
spell cover up?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's an interesting area. New York is an interesting area. Well, they have all those daylight sightings of rockets even over New York City itself. Ever see any of those?
No, no.
Yeah, they have they had some high speed projectile of some nature, and it was arcing through, basically almost through the skyscrapers. And that's seen quite often. I mean, that things like that have been reported over the city quite often. Also, we get orange spheres. Orange spheres are almost a dime a dozen around here.
I had an experience in 1978, I believe it was, or 1979 on 23rd Street and between on Broadway.
Okay.
I saw, it wasn't a UFO. I saw a cross. I know this is bizarre. A cross of light moving sort of south to north.
South to north. Okay.
And there was a guy parallel to me, and I didn't know him, and we both looked up at the same time. And after it had passed, we looked at each other and we just said, we saw it. And he went his way and I went mine. It was bizarre.
When it was it flying like looked kind of like a plane with the wings that closer to the front of it?
No, it was just moving on a trajectory, steadily. It wasn't a UFO. As I say, it was a cross.
Okay.
Lighted cross, and it was just sort of, and it was moving up, and then it went out of sight.
There was an old wood print of a German city that goes back to like 1500.
Yeah, that's the 1561 Nuremberg.
Right. Now that one there, it had everything. It had the flying crosses. It had, just about every shape you can imagine was depicted in that painting.
But they were black or colored. This was light. It was light.
Was it reflected light, or was it like it was lighted from within?
It was like lighted from within. It was light, shining.
Okay. And it was flying from south to north, and you were around Midtown?
Yeah.
Okay, then that would be, I guess that would be flying up the Hudson River then?
No, I'm not very good at this kind of stuff. I was on Broadway going downtown.
Oh, okay. All right.
Walking downtown, and it was sort of going upwards from the point at which, from a little bit further, it was in the sky, it was sort of not exactly overhead. It was sort of maybe to the left of me and moving upward, but it was sort of, it was at an angle so that
Okay.
it's hard to describe it, but all I know is that somebody else did see it.
Okay. Well, like I said, about a year ago, the New York Post had a big 2-page section that they did on just various types of UFOs that have been seen over New York City and its environs. And it's been apparently this has been going on for years. The one image that comes to mind is somebody was in a helicopter and they were flying down around Battery Park, and they were facing towards Brooklyn. And all of a sudden, one of these rocket-like devices took off and was flying at probably 1,000 miles per hour at least. And it was not large. It was relatively small, but it was flying at a high rate of speed and was flying at in a kind of a curved course. And those have been described on a number of occasions. So New York is let's face it, everything's there in New York.
But you don't usually think of New York as being a UFO hotbed, but actually it is.
Yeah,
Well, it is. It is at the edge of the UFO corridor, as they describe it. You know, that extends from Montauk all the way east past Pine Bush, New York.
Yep.
And New York City is right at the very southern edge of that corridor.
yeah. Matter of fact, they've got, like Bruce is saying, there have been images of these probably hundreds of objects out on the eastern part of Long Island, and you see them flying. And when they take off, they're heading back towards, back towards the city and to the Pine Bush area.
And
Yeah,
Carol Costa did articles on all of the UFO sightings over Long Island. And interestingly enough, she showed a peak of sightings right after the sightings over near Pine Bush dropped off to near zero in 1997. And it looked as though they shifted their activity to the east. And I found that to be very interesting.
Interestingly, one of the things that took place out there at the air station now, I think, what's it called? Very innocuous. It was called, well, the Montauk Air Station. And apparently it was all part of air defense. They don't talk about any flying going on out there since World War II, which I don't believe is accurate because they have a nice airport there. It's been turned over for civilian use. But the thing was that in 1997, I think it was the Air National Guard got rid of it, and it was excessed. And in 2001, it was turned over to, I think, to private developers. So in 97, that's when things stopped flying towards Pine Bush. Maybe that's the reason, they moved operations, especially if they were unacknowledged operations from Long Island to someplace else. Matter of fact, it was upstate. Anyway, it was to someplace else, I think. Maybe up another air base up there. Stewart, was it Stewart Air Force Base? Oh, you're muted, Bruce.
What about Stewart Air Force Base?
They moved whatever operations, and it was the air defense operations or radar related operations. I think they moved from the operation down there at Montauk up to Stewart Air Force Base.
I know a lot has been moved there to Stewart Air Force Base. What surprised me in my study there is that when I asked people there, even in the Federal Aviation Tower, what about your radar? Don't you see all of this activity over near Pine Bush? And he says, we have it automatically censored and blocked out so nobody could see it. We censor all of that information. And so they know that activity is over there. They just aren't recording it so that somebody can use that information.
Right. It's probably done by transponder because all military aircraft are kind of exempt from transponders except from the standpoint of safety. So if they're not flying military missions, they may have transponders on, but also maybe what they do, they filter military transponders so that they don't show up as tracks on the radar,
Exactly.
at least on recordings.
One of the most spectacular events that I experienced out there was with a group of 11 other men from MUFON, and this was in late 1997. And we formed a group, a team that would go out into the fields and watch for UAP over the area. This was on the Owens Farm near the Indian Mound there, where I did a lot of my research. And one of the most spectacular things we recorded coming in, and this was a whole group of people with their cameras with my single lens reflex camera, and I was taking time exposures, and others were taking video, and we had a recorder that was picking up the FAA transmissions from the planes. And we see this large plane coming in. It looked like a boomerang. It was very strange. The wings were sticking out a lot further than what would normally be for the length of the fuselage. It had flashing lights on it, and it came swooping down over us, right over us, headed for the Stewart main runway. And we heard the pilot ask the tower to turn the runway lights up nice and bright. Well, what is fascinating about this is that the wings were glowing orange, and it was highly unusual. And I have a website out there on this, and the video was spectacular. And my time exposure showed something very different than the video. The video shows the shape of the craft with the blinking lights on it, it's fuselage, but the time exposure shows a pulsating energy field of orange stripes on its wings and fuselage. It was pulsating as it flew overhead. And I told a guy about this who had been a service mechanic for fighter jets and had been stationed, worked with fighter pilots. And he said, well, do you know what you saw? And I said, no, that's the aurora. And it was coming in from space because it was probably having fuel difficulties or something of this nature and had to make an emergency landing at Stewart. That would be one of the emergency places for it to land. And it could only make one pass like the shuttle when it was coming down. And so that's what we saw.
Really? I wonder about the pulsating wing, light on the wings. Wonder what
Right.
that.
It is very unusual, yes, in terms of maybe the ionic drive, the EMF ionic drive on it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. The whole thing about drives. There was a video about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and it was actually taken from the International Space Station. And in the image, off in the distance, maybe a half a mile from the space station, there were 2 silver objects. And one of the objects on the left, with the Earth kind of in the background, the object on the left was sending out pulses of energy. And it was hitting the other object, which was maybe a mile or so away. And it kept hitting it for about a minute. And then all of a sudden, the object on the right that was being hit with the beam, the pulsating beam, took off like a rocket. It was instantaneous. It was there 1 second, and in a flash of a second, it was gone. Now, that was one of several things. First of all, if it was an alien thing, I have no clue what they were trying to do, what message they were trying to send. If it was an experiment, I was thinking perhaps what they're doing, they're using pulsed energy as a source to propel some object into space by hitting it with these pulses. Or then again, it might have been some type of a laser weapon or a weapon, but it didn't explain why the thing took off at the rate of speed that it did. It didn't blow up, it didn't evaporate or anything. It took off. And it was very clearly, the image was very clear, and you could see what was going on. The only thing is you had to kind of speculate as to what it represented. Anybody else see that, or?
I think I saw something similar to that. Are you talking about the one, the STS-48 with all the ice chunks out there? No, that moved
No,
around.
that was the president COO.
Mark, right.
Yeah. No, this was recent. It was a recent live image from the ISS before they turned off the camera. Okay, it was the automatic camera, and they kept it going. That's the reason I think it was observing an experiment, some type of a scientific experiment. And it wasn't probably military centric, because they wouldn't have had it on. They would have turned the camera off before the experiment took place, unless they were trying to document something. And part of the documentation was what happens when you keep hitting something with this beam. You know, it had to recycle. It was obvious that it was going like every second, it was sending out a pulse beam. Very, very bright, but it was very specific, roughly 1 second apart. So probably if you Google it, I should have taken the image off the, you know, maybe it's been scrubbed by now, but it was quite clear. It was a very interesting image, as are all those images that they don't know they're getting until it's too late. Okay, anything else? Why don't we go? Mindy, I see you're still out there. How you doing? There
Hi,
she is.
everybody. Can you
Hi,
hear me?
Mindy.
Yeah, how you
Hi.
doing, Mindy?
I've enjoyed this. I'm good, everybody. Thank you. I've enjoyed this presentation very much, very informative. I don't know if you saw the comment I put in chat, but that there was actually mention that there was a patent dispute about the transistor with Bell Labs. And that was floating around some of the UFO meetings and stuff that I went to and conferences and all. So I never really heard anything about the upshot of that patent dispute, but whether Bell Labs actually is the rightful owner of the patent, or the US Army, or the American people. I don't know how that turned out. Does anybody know?
The only thing, it's my understanding that when they turn over, and that was they did that quite a bit, things that were being developed, because the Army didn't want, to this day, the Army does not want to develop things on its own. It doesn't want to spend the money. But what they will do, they'll turn over the component or what they need to have made, they'll turn it over to contractors. And the contractors will invest their own, what they call research and development money. And when they do it on their own dime, they expect to make the profit. So the ownership, if it belonged to the Army at one point, they turned over the licensing of it to whomever. And like Bell Labs would be making all types of things that the military needed desperately. And they did it much more efficiently than the Army could have done, even though the Army had very, very bright people working for them. Still, Bell Labs was Bell Labs. And so I know that that took place. Now, the patent, again, if the Army had it and the Army owned it, they would probably be willing, depending on how badly they want the thing, they could turn it over, but they could put strings on it too, that you know they couldn't. There's certain things they couldn't do with it, like you have export requirements. So something that's very critical to the military might also have dual applicability in the commercial sector, but you couldn't sell it, you know, on the foreign market. You had to go through all types of hoops that you had to jump through. And I think that they wanted what they represented more so than the value of the license. And that was the negotiating point.
I may have misspoken mentioning the Army. It might have been the Navy, it might have been the Air Force. I'm not really sure what branch of the military was part of this patent dispute, but I was just wondering if anybody heard anything current about that.
Well, I can say this, it's something I just saw today. James Forrestal, when he was the Secretary of Defense, first Secretary of Defense, he didn't want to spend a lot of money. And they were having a big argument about radar and air defense, you know, the emerging threat from the Russians and so on. But he didn't want to spend money. So the military was doing things that may have seemed on the cheap, because that's what was driving the train. At the same time, that a lot of this stuff in like 1947, Forrestal, I think he was still alive then. That may have been the driving factor for Corso, because if Corso was the one that was turning over technologies for reverse engineering and patents, it would have been to save the Army money, but to get the benefits of what those patents would represent as far as new technology. That was more important to the Army or the Navy or the Air Force, having the advanced technology. They wouldn't make any money from the patents themselves.
Right. Corso spoke about UFO technology being classified under the umbrella of foreign technology.
Foreign Technology Division, yep, FTD, yep. Wright-Patterson, that's where they still do it. Okay, yeah. Well, I
Thank you,
can,
Jeff.
okay, anytime, Mindy. Very good, good question, nice comment. too. Anything else?
Let's see.
Okay,
Nope.
Stan, we'll go around the round table here.
Hey, I work for Bell Laboratories in Homedale. And the thing about the transistor was kind of very well known. My feeling is that basically Bell Labs, with some additional information, developed the transistor. It was done on their property at their location. I worked for Bell Labs for a couple of years, and they had a group which was called Up on the Hill, and that was a special group. So I would say quite confidently that Bell Laboratories actually developed the transistor. They had some additional help, but basically they were the group that put it together.
Right, and that was Shockley and his team.
Exactly.
Did you ever hear, interestingly, Shockley, and I don't know who made the disparaging remarks, whether it was some jealous engineer that worked with him or what, but they said he wasn't that bright as far as that type of engineering went.
Well, basically to get into Bell Laboratories, you need a 3.8 or a 4.0. That's for a start. Medical exam, another interview, and another interview to where you're going. So, excuse me, they had the best and brightest there. And that's where they came up with a lot of cool stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great place to work. They didn't pay you a lot of money, but they probably had over 100 clubs you could join. And I'm pretty sure there wasn't a UFO club in the group, but about over 100 clubs you could join. So
Right.
it's an organization to work for.
Yeah,
You'd enjoy the ambiance of Bell Laboratories.
yeah. Did by any chance in your travels, did you ever come across Bob Lucky?
That doesn't ring a bell, no.
He was one of the directors of Bell Labs. I think when it became Bellcore, or when Bellcore came into existence. Yeah.
We were also, insofar as I do work for CBS News, which you know, and flight TWA 800, a number of people had reported seeing a missile come out of the ocean to hit it. And they were sitting on a dock at a bar, just overlooking, and they actually saw the missile come out of the water and hit the plane. Now, I covered it from probably day one till day it's time to go home. And it was interesting on how they took the plane from the ocean and really put it back together again. And then they came up with the idea, well, the middle gas tank, so on and so forth. But it still kind of rings my ear that if you're sitting at a bar or on a platform looking over the water and you see a missile come out of the water, hit the plane explodes, what there is there to understand other than that, what
It
happened?
was shot down.
It was shot down, and they kind of blamed the military, whoops, and that's about where it ended. But it was an interesting spirited time we spent out there covering the story.
I spent a lot of time on that, talking with a number of pilots that I know. The interesting things that came out that I find fascinating, first of all, the closest military missile was down off of Maryland. It was out of Norfolk, and it was one of those target drones, orange target drones, and that wasn't it.
No.
The other interesting thing was that the seats in the first class section, when they first recovered all the debris and started laying it out, there were 3 seats that had a brown substance on them that turned out that it was some type of rocket fuel,
Correct.
residue from rocket fuel.
Right,
Those seats, after the fact, disappeared.
that is true.
And the other interesting thing was that the way they recreated the debris on the floor of that hangar, they marked everything that was found. I think there were 3 areas of the ocean that they found the debris scattered in. And they marked each one with different color flags.
Right.
And somebody went in and apparently they were changing some of the debris, moving it from one portion to another portion and changing the flags on it.
Really?
Yeah. So there were so many, there were more gaps in that story. And I don't care who is the one that's saying that this is all true. I think they're having real problems with credibility.
Well, I think there are a lot of gaps in all of this, because obviously if you were kind of to relate to the American public about what you see, about what you know, it would probably not be a good idea. I mean, even if a UFO crashes, obviously, you know, I fly also, and I'm still glad I'm alive, 172. But when these things come in, I mean, there's no Avis, there's no Hertz out there that rents out flying saucers to these guys. You either make it the first time or you don't make it this first time. But I think to the whole group, and I think everybody talks about them, they're here. But if you were to tell the American public, could you imagine the chaos that would happen? Really?
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. I mean, there's a report, there's 138 militia groups. Could you imagine everybody with a something rather in the backyard looking for something that flies up in the sky? So I think on the government's part, a lot of this is kept quiet for a reason. But
Yeah.
our small group is interesting because all of us have seen something. We have the curiosity is like, oh, what was that? Or what was that? So just as long as this group stays together, it just keeps them on their toes as we just keep on seeing other things. I mean, also, like, I have pictures obviously of things like that, but if you look at our eyes versus their eyes, they're much bigger. Do they see more? Of course they do. Does the camera see more? Of course. But we just have the curiosity of like, wow, where did that come from? So just as long as we have that curiosity, I think it's kind of cool.
Yeah, I agree. I think speculating about all this stuff is 3/4 of the fun of even hearing it.
Exactly.
I have a question.
It's like a puzzle, putting a puzzle together. It's the
Right.
fun
Stanley,
together, never mind the final product. But when you put it together, it's kind of cool because wow. And then you start a new puzzle.
Yeah.
Stanley,
Yes, sir.
you said you saw a missile come out of the ocean and strike the 747?
Did I personally? No, but the people that were interviewed who were sitting out there saw it. It came out of the ocean and then hit the plane.
Because airline pilots that were flying planes behind the TWA
Right.
flight, they saw a missile come up and hit it.
That's
But
correct.
they never described, which direction it came, whether it was from the side or from below.
Well, we're kind of thinking of two things. Excuse me. Coming from the ocean, okay. So a missile from a possible sub by mistake, or somebody on the marsh nearby. It was kind of hard to determine, but most of the people who saw it seemed to say it came out of the water, straight up.
I talked to a guy when down near Seabright, who said he was with the EMTs and was on a practice mission in offshore of Sandy Hook at the time of the accident.
Right.
And he and his whole crew saw a missile come towards the plane and hit the plane
Right.
from the direction of the land. And so
Right.
and they thought it was coming from Fort Earl. And one of the guys on board, they said, well, I know some friends at Fort Earl. Let me give them a call. And he did. And he said, that was a false firing of a missile on board one of the ships. They were moving the canister of it and it went off and it took off. And that was the explanation they gave them, that it was an accident. But at the same time, the FBI showed up when they got back and they confiscated all their cameras and they told them this never happened. And so they didn't want them to be relating that story. Unfortunately, I talked to one of the people who was in that boat that witnessed it. So.
Right. Those stories do get out sooner or later. Immediately they don't, but given time, it'll come out. It's just human nature. And you can't put a cap on human nature. Just you have something you need to say, you're going to say it. So
Right.
That's the interviews that were done. And once again, they still blame it on the middle gas tank blowing up and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Right.
None of the pilots I know go with that one.
Be what it may, it's just, but that's why we're out here, and that's what I did for 35 years. We just kind of do those wonderful stories, kind of throw it out there and say, hey, whatever,
Yeah, yeah.
and then you walk away from it.
Hey, Joe,
Yes, yes, Mindy.
it seems like Bruce has resolved a lot of his technical issues. Can he redo his talk on the Hudson Valley sightings?
What do you say, Bruce?
Yeah, I would love to.
Okay,
Yes, I can do that. And, you know, I have a book out for those who haven't seen it yet on my 11, 12 years of study in Pine Bush. I had over 140 close encounters and documented on film and video. And so it's, there's no question in my mind, and this is, I've been talking about this, is that there is an underground alien base in that valley, literally. And the ships come out of the ground and go into the ground. And Ellen Crystal actually witnessed a tunnel opening up in the ground and warm air coming out of it. And when they realized that she was a witness, that the tunnel closed again. But this is how they get into their underground base without smashing into trees and the ground. They can go right straight down this, whatever this beam is that opens up the earth and allows them into their underground base. But they've been there for thousands of years. And that's the interesting thing.
yeah.
Probably the most unusual and humorous encounter I had was when I was on Albany Post Road, which goes sort of north-south and near, you know, south of Pine Bush. And I was coming to a cross intersection at night, and I see this set of lights hovering over the intersection. And I know there was no traffic light there, okay? Because it's out in the middle of the rural countryside. And so I grab my camera and start videotaping. As I get closer and closer and closer, it's two lights hovering above the intersection, and they turn red. They were white and then they turned red. So I stopped, you know, and then they turned green, and I turned left, and I pulled over to see what the heck it was. And I was taking video of it all the time. And it just took off. When I analyzed the video, you can see a small shuttlecraft, dome shaped, semi-transparent dome on top of a flat bottom with a whole bunch of devices sticking out the bottom of it. And when I passed under it, it was no more than 2 or 3 feet above my van. And I got this very strong telepathic thought in my head: I'm just a traffic light. I'm just a traffic light. And that's the most funny encounter I've had out there.
Just a traffic light. Okay, well, Bruce, maybe you might want to do this in December.
Yes, we can do this in December.
Okay, all right. Well, it's 4:35 and we made it through. And this will be uploaded. I'm going to check and make sure that it did copy.
Okay,
And,
very good.
I'll send out the information in about a week or two for the December meeting, and also January as well. I have somebody lined up for that one too. So,
Thank you,
how's
Joe.
that?
Joe, I
Thank
also
you.
want to tell you, I know we're friends on Facebook. I'm also friends on Facebook with Bruce Maccabee and Tim Beckley. So you might want to reach out to them about doing some presentations.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, definitely. I've been considering dropping my Facebook. I think I sent out something on my Facebook page. However, yeah, there is a lot of folks out there that, you know, I don't want to lose and everything. So, yeah, I'll take you up on that, Mindy.
Good. Thank you
You
so
will.
much for doing this.
Okay,
Yes, thank you.
for
This
being
was
here.
enjoyable.
Thank you all for being here and part of this.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, I have nothing else. Susan, Stanley, Mindy, Bruce, look forward to talking to you all next month.
Excellent.
Thank
Right.
you.
Maybe there will be something before. I'm not sure yet. I will do periodic things. You know, something hot pops up. You know, we'll do an ad hoc. So
Did I show you that video of the missile that nearly exploded when it passed over the TWA jetliner at Seabright?
I don't think, no, I don't think so. I
It's
didn't see that.
outrageous. I mean, you look at this, oh my God, what the heck? You
Yeah,
know,
I'd like to see it, Bruce.
and where did it come from? It came from the sea, direction of the
Right.
sea.
Okay, all right, Bruce, send me a link to it or whatever.
Okay,
Okay, let me see it.
will do.
Okay, and I know that we all have things to do. It is Saturday night, so thanks
Yep.
for being here. I enjoyed talking with you all today.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much, Joseph.
Thank you.
Bye.
Night now.